Do you remember the toilet paper frenzy of 2020 or the sudden quiet lockdowns? The COVID-19 pandemic wasn't just a health crisis. It was a massive global display of collective behavior and social movements. The pandemic served as an extraordinary real-time experiment in collective behavior. It demonstrated how a shared external threat triggered widespread, often emotionally driven collective responses, ranging from panic and hypervigilance to organized resistance against the public health measures. Analyzing the pandemic through a sociological lens helps us understand not only the immediate behavioral shifts, but also the enduring social and political divisions that emerged. It helps us start our journey into the study of collective behavior and social movements. Almost every lecture on this topic starts with the theory of mass hysteria. Le Bon was analyzing the French Revolution, in which people went out and killed people in the thousands, chopping their heads off with a guillotine. What a barbaric way to do it. And yet these people who were seemingly normal and average people were doing some of the most heinous things ever. What would drive people to be so irrational? And he believed it was mass hysteria. Le Bon believed that one of the causes or sets of causes for mass hysteria has to do with the emotions that happen when you bring people together. When mobs come together, there's an intensity of behavior that occurs. And they start to share a common mood, or what he called homogeneity of mood and action. They start doing the same thing, sort of a herd mentality. And when this happens, they get very emotional, and that leads to irrational behavior. They become easily directed by anyone who stands up and directs people to do one thing versus another. And if they direct them to guillotine people, they'll do that. But the key is the emotions heightened, and somebody directs that emotion in one way or another. I'm going to try to convince you in the next few slides that collective behavior is not just about riots and revolutions. We do use information from this area to study those things, but it's also about just us coordinating with lots of other people. Lots of other people can be 20 or 30 people in a group or a team or something like that, but it can be millions of people around the globe. It's all of those things. Herbert Blumer was an American sociologist. He's the one who coined the expression symbolic interaction. And he argued the same thing, that we can't just sort of understand people based on revolutions, that people work in groups. And so there are different types of groups. There are acting groups, expressive groups, publics, and masses. Acting groups are those who do have a clear goal and some unity, and that's quite often associated with a protest. But there could be expressive groups. They lack a specific goal and are more about tension release, such as at a rock concert. There's also publics, people concerned with the specific issues, such as voters debating a policy, and masses, anonymous, loosely organized people that could easily be redirected into one of the other groups as well. All of these are situations where individuals are working amidst groups. There are several theories in your chapter about collective behavior in social movements. And I want to juxtapose mass hysteria theory with emergent norm theory. Emergent norm theory argues that people participate in collective events for different reasons, this idea of differential expression. Some people there are leaders in the movement, and we call these ego-involved participants, and some of them are simply spectators. And I've been to many social movements, and that's exactly what I experienced being there. But the reason that's important is that just throwing a bunch of people together doesn't mean they all act the same. And as a result, if you really want to understand social movements, you have to understand different roles that are occurring at the same time. So really, emergent norm theory tries to understand how individuals come to accept group restraints, given their diverse backgrounds coming to those movements. And it's a fairly rational process, which explains why the vast majority of social movements and collective behavior are very rational in nature. They don't become like Le Bon's hysteria in any way at all. Ultimately, this could lead to the concept of collective identity when we take a social movement or any reference group that we're connected with, and that becomes part of who we are. And that will influence our behavior in the future above and beyond anything that the crowd is doing. Another big theory in the field is something called value-added theory. And this perspective helps us see that it's not just about the participant in a social movement, it's also understanding the type of social movement that people are in. Obviously, people are going to behave differently in things like a panic or a craze compared to, say, a traditional social movement where you see large-scale protests around the country. And so by understanding this nexus between the type of participant and the type of activity is going to help us understand how people are going to behave in those things. Finally, this theory is really cool because it helps us understand why a social movement might occur in the first place. There are multiple stages, and your book goes into them in detail, but it's important to understand that society has to be ready for something. They have to see that there's an issue in the first place, but several things have to happen before an issue that is seen as a problem that needs to be dealt with and whether it actually occurs. Collective behavior can be understood from the lens of social structure and personality by examining what actually happens at large-scale events. You should know that the vast majority of protests are very calm in nature, but they involve three things: the assembly phase, the gathering phase, and the dispersal phase. The assembly phase focuses on what brings people together in the first place. If you don't know it, the single best predictor based on research of whether you show up at a large-scale social movement or not is being asked. So you have tens of thousands of people together. What do they actually do? To be quite frank, humans, in this case, are kind of boring. I bet you could guess what people do, but tons of research shows that we do one of several behaviors. One is we typically do arcs around speakers, and that's very common. I remember when I was there at some of these larger protests, we couldn't have arcs because there were literally tens of thousands of people. So if anything, we arced around loudspeakers, which were set up across all of those people, because that's the only way you're going to hear somebody at such a large event. There's also lots of lines. People queue up to go to the bathroom or get services or something like that. So there's usually not a lot of negative behavior that goes on. It doesn't happen like that very much at all. And what I mean by negative behavior, there's almost no violence or anything like that at these kind of events. Occasionally it does happen. Sometimes it's even staged. But as a general rule, you don't see that even in the largest of protests. Finally, there's dispersals. And there could be different types of dispersals. I'm just going to focus on routine dispersals where the event ends and people get into public transportation or cars or walk away. But the point is the vast majority of them end in this way. They're very routine. They're not very excited. Occasionally something is coerced because there's some violence and the police try to break things up. But the vast majority of the time, they're routine dispersals. In some ways, this area should belong under symbolic interaction, but we'll leave it here under social structure and personality, and that is the sociology of collective memories and the sociology of the future. When we talk about collective memories, think about what are your thoughts of World War II? Was it a good war or a bad war? The Vietnam War, was that a good war or a bad war? Your thoughts about that probably are not completely your own, and that is, I doubt you've studied those two wars in any detail. But you still have a sense of whether they're good or bad. And so another area of sociological research and theory is this idea that somehow humans not only collectively gather and do actions together, but somehow as a whole, we gather the same thoughts about something. Not only that, but we also have a sort of a collective sense of the future. Is the future going to be bright or not? I suspect if you're a middle-class American right now, you think your future is bright. But I would argue, if you look deep down, this is an American thing. Imagine if you were growing up in a very poor area of the world where it's kind of bleak. You probably have a very different sense of what the future is likely to be like for you. So how is it that groups collectively come together and think about what their future is going to be? And both our collective memories and our sense of the future impact our thoughts and feelings right here today. They influence our decisions of what we're going to do. So understanding how people collectively understand their past and their future helps us understand people's decisions that they make today. Have you ever been in a work group in which you have several people working together and some disagreement about how to proceed with the project? And typically in those situations, if there's enough people, there might be 2 or 3 people who believe in one way to go and another few people agree in another way. And when you think about it, these are like mini collective behaviors. And that's how the group processes perspective focuses on collective behavior in the group processes area. In this case, we use terminology like coalitions and people working together to achieve an end. But it is a kind of collective behavior, just writ small. Your book goes into some detail about how coalitions work and what the free rider problem is in social dilemmas. The only thing I want to stress for the lecture part of this is that while most of us are not going to participate in large-scale social movements, we do deal with small-scale social movements at work, at our churches, and other places. And these processes can help us be more effective in how we try to resolve the issues that those groups deal with. Large-scale social movements deal with the free rider problem and social dilemmas to a degree, but you see it much more tangibly because it's right in front of you when you're dealing with groups at work and other organizations you belong to. So we've talked about collective behavior and social change in many different ways, mostly on sort of the protest level and that sort of thing. We did talk about it also on the organizational level, if you're part of an organization, and how to bring change that way. But as we end, I also want to point out a couple of last things. First of all, that there are whole organizations involved in social change. And so if you ever wanted a career in social movements, there are organizations out there that you can join to do that. But for the rest of us who are not going to be doing that the rest of our life, I want to encourage everyone to participate in this society that we're put in. Whether it's strangers lining up to help after a hurricane, a stadium erupting in a song, a crowd rallying for justice. These are moments reflecting our deep human need to connect, to respond, to act together. That is really what collective behavior is about. As students of society, as we end the semester, I want to say you're not just observers, you're participants. And your awareness of how people come together, follow, lead, and sometimes disrupt the norm gives you the power to shape the story of our shared humanity. So go forward with curiosity, compassion, and courage, and don't be afraid to be part of something bigger than yourself.